Good day and hello, my fellow well dwellers. I'm Eric Freiberger, and welcome to the I Am a Well Dweller YouTube channel. I am attempting to do something different with this video, as I invited my friend Ty Ragan to come on the show with me as we debrief about the Deep and Wide conference from a couple weeks ago that we were at together. In it, we reflect on some of the highlights and things that we really took away from a lot of the presenters and conversations there. We also reflect on some of the things we'd like to improve on and see that may be better in future, as well as steps towards where we go from here and looking towards the future of Ecclesial Engagement with Disability in Canada. This is a bit of a learning curve for me. I'm kind of new to the YouTube platform and what it means to record a lot of these videos. So this time with Ty actually got split in the middle. And I'm hoping that in future I can figure out ways to navigate this a little better, as well as improve upon my own speech abilities as I converse with you as my listeners, as well as my guests. So let's see what happens in future. However, I hope you do take a lot out of Ty's and my conversation, and that it impacts you and some of your thoughts towards disability, dignity, and hope. All right, well, let's get to it. Here is the Deep and Wide Conference after show with myself, Eric Freiberger, and my friend Ty Ragan. Well, hey, this is great. This is the I'm a Well Dweller channel, and I'm Eric Freiberger, and today I am joined with my friend Ty Ragan. This is really exciting because Ty and I have been connected online for at least a couple of years, I believe.
At least a couple, yeah.
And we finally got the chance to meet face-to-face a couple weeks ago at the Deep and Wide conference here in Calgary, Alberta, at the Ambrose University. So welcome, Ty.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, no, it was actually quite good at the conference. It was one of the things I was able, as last little bit, I've been doing some more in-depth research on basically disability theology and what this means pragmatically and practically for the church. It comes from my own lived experience with some invisible neurological mental health things, but also with my son with very visible disabilities and the conflicts that have happened within churches around persons with disabilities being present and being active in ministry. And those conflicts just weren't as a dad. When I was a youth and children's pastor, we'd have these conflicts as well as families who tried to connect with churches. And this is why most families with kids with disabilities just don't go, don't attend, don't participate anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think from the missional standpoint, that's kind of my roots too.
Mm-hmm.
I just see a real call and a need to be engaging those people with disabilities and involving them in an inclusive manner, not just within church activities, but I'd love to see the church engaging into the community itself and participating in relationships with those who are their neighbors and who have disabilities. So I was excited to hear some of the talks that would be taking place at the Deep and Wide conference. So, yeah, that's really what drew me there too. So who were you really excited to see? I mean, we saw lots of names of speakers. Who were the people you were excited to see at the conference?
Honestly, I wasn't sure what format I was taking this year. We had the Friday pre-show that was set to each locale, but then like last year, you could go to different areas on the Ambrose campus, and you could go to different talks, not just ones that were being hosted at Calgary. So you could see some of the other talks happening. So I wasn't sure the format that would take, but I was intrigued more to be, I think, in person this year, like I was last year, just to see more of who was coming to be engaged. Some of the information being shared, I find can start some good conversations, depending on where you're at in the journey. But I really want to see who was engaging from the church community on this idea, on this concept, on this intersectionality of communities and really wanting to do something different. That's always what intrigues me the most.
Yeah, I think so too. I was excited to see who was going to be there. That was also my first time being there physically as a person. Last year I was there online, and same thing as you. I took in some of the talks that were taking place in
Mm-hmm.
Hamilton and as well as here in Calgary. And this year they kind of on the Friday night, we really just centered in on the Calgary experience.
We did,
Yeah.
which I actually appreciate having that extra night. I think that was one of the things I gave on feedback too last year. Was there any way to tap into something more and have more speakers? And it was great because I think there was a good rhythm too, because we two of the speakers there were actually students at Ambrose who were presenting their research papers. It's unfortunate the one, because of her own health conditions, and wasn't able to actually present, but she was able to connect the next day and be at the conference. But the idea of her paper being shaped around that practicality of how do you actually do this with kids in a universal way,
Mhm.
not just creating that one specific special space for one or two children, but how do we just create a space that's functional, especially when it's adapting spaces is what we're doing. And that's I like to see those kinds of ideas happening,
Yeah.
especially with those who are engaging at that stage.
Yeah, and I think one of the really cool things too about that Friday night was it really focused in. We're talking about ecclesial engagement. We're talking
Hmm.
about the real Calgary environment.
Yeah.
So we could see it in our own context rather than being pulled out into Eastern context or
Hmm.
West Coast. And I think, as you mentioned too, this idea of experiencing. Um, Kind of different this year. They had that quiet room that they developed too, which I think was really a cool way for people that attended to actually not just hear about a way to have a quiet space for those who are, you probably describe it better than I do, but people who have a disability that needs that space to quieten themselves or
Hmm.
de-stress and so on. Um, you don't just talk about it, you get to experience it by going into it. And I thought that was kind
Hmm.
of a cool development there too.
It wasn't. I love the fact that the person who developed it basically used things that were cost effective as well. So it wasn't this mystery of this big expense, because as we know, church treasurers can get scared.
Mhm.
But this was very cost effective, and it really is. How do we create this space it's easy, and how do you easily access? I mean, this the space at the conference. You basically went just next door, and it was there. So how could that look in a space, whether you're renting? And so maybe it's sort of a pop up. Maybe someone has like a tent or something you could use, or is it a space that can be designed in a church, an office or something like that could be designed for that?
Mhm.
The the key always, I keep reminding people as I talk and work with different churches on this, is: do you have to track someone down to get into that space, or is it already unlocked? So often we don't think through the simple steps. Like, well, yeah, well, if someone needs to regulate, they can go to the library, they can go here, they can go there. I'm like, okay, that's great. So let's go there. Oh, the door's locked. Well, who has the key? Oh, if the person's in the midst of needing to regulate themselves or get support in regulating themselves, they're not thinking clearly enough to go find 12 two different sets of people of who has the key either.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Can you talk a bit about uh, regulating? I'm kind of curious about that. And I know when they described this room at the conference, they talked about using stimulation and so
Hmm.
on to bring that regulation to a person. Why is regulation so important, and uh, how is that done?
I mean, everyone can kind of feel anxious at moments, right? We all have that. That's part of the way we're designed, the way we're created. You have that fight, flight, or freeze. You get that queasy feeling. You maybe have a wealth of emotions. It could be happiness, it could be anger, it could be joy, it could be any of those subsets. When what happens when we dysregulate is we can't normally have a valve control. So it just overwhelms you in that emotional spectrum. And so that's the emotional regulation piece. So being able to shift. Sometimes you'll use something like a dialectical behavioral therapy technique or a cognitive behavioral therapy technique. And those are things that grow out of mindfulness. The psychologists then practice them and realize that you could actually use them to help someone shift their mindsets. With sensory rooms or quiet rooms, it's removing all the inputs, if you will, all those different loud auditory inputs. So one of the things that can dysregulate you is think of a worship service and how loud they can be. So if you have a sensitivity with auditory or visual inputs, you're being bombarded. And so the quiet space helps that to quiet down. It helps you to try different textures, different sounds, different things to bring you back and help you center yourself. Kind of like with the deep breathing or the counting, this actually allows you to even go a bit further because now you're stepping out of that noisy environment, all that external noise, to really work with your internal noise you're having. In schools and other places, there's things like a snoozling room or a multi-sensory room that has different things around different lights and things like that as well. That can help as well with those sorts of things. Different types of chairs you can sit on that rock or move or vibrate or massage. All those different things that can help you. What works for you? When I was reading Father Matthew's book, God Loves the Autistic Brain, or Autistic Mind, I can't remember which one it is. I loved how he first started off by giving some facts about what autism actually was. But then he talked about prayer and how you have to do it differently with that type of mindset. He goes, what we look at as strange if you're neurotypical, and Father Matthew himself is autistic. So he helped design some of the lower sensory mass services to allow for that kind of lower sensory engagement, but more presence. He says stimming is a way to cope, is a way to soothe. It's a way to center. And so what is prayer if that isn't stimming? Mm-hmm. That way to center yourself and quiet yourself.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was sort of thinking too of how it's not just the lights and the noises, but also you think about it when you're in worship and you're in a church community and a church service, you're opening yourself to a spiritual movement too, and a spiritual presence. And that spiritual presence can have also that same emotional response, that overwhelming sense.
Yeah.
You hear the pastor say something that particularly strikes a part of your life, and all of a sudden you need a moment to clear your mind, to focus and recenter yourself. So I think that a space like that is not just for someone who is on spectrum or autistic or has a disability of any kind. It can be for anyone who needs that place to allow themselves to recenter and even allow for that touch of the spirit to continue to work in a more intimate and close way. So I think that's
and that's the concept of universal design, not just creating sort of an accommodation, but how you build things so that it just seamlessly works. Kind of like the comic strip that shows, the janitor telling the kid in the wheelchair, I'll shovel the ramp once I'm done with the stairs. But if you had shoveled the ramp first, everyone could actually get into the school.
Yeah.
Just shifting that mindset.
Yeah. Even Jesus needed to retreat to the mountains, right?
Yes.
And the Garden of Gethsemane. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Well, I think there was a lot of good moments in the weekend as well, the talks. So what were some of the highlights for you? What were some of the great points that you found spoke to you through the weekend?
I actually really enjoyed the plenary sessions out of Hamilton. And their ability to connect the dots on life and church. Where the challenge always is with that is it's always interesting at a conference and then realizing that if this was any other conference, the speakers would actually be on the main stage, but no one has taken the step to actually make it accessible for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then flipping that as well, I really did enjoy the publishing discussion and the Madden Crip Theology Press. So more of an open, collaborative press for theological research around disabilities, different books they've published, the reason why that was created. The one person who was sharing, he had his book about, just bought it myself to read, on basically the Christian support worker, and what that should be looking like and what the struggles are with that. So that conversation around not just research and understanding, but what does it actually mean in a practical ministry sense? I know that on a Friday night, one of the students' papers had started with that going back to Genesis 2 and talk about maybe is it possible disability is built by design into creation with the cleaving out of the rib kind of analogy,
Mm-hmm.
which I can kind of see that. I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any stretch of the imagination. Nor do I claim to even understand Hebrew. So it was an interesting thought process. I, of course, lean more into the Genesis 1 account of creation, where God talks about creating us in the complete image. And then through my own readings that I alluded to a little bit in my talks as well, was that idea of healing being more of the sociocultural implications. We're not looking at cure, we're looking at actually breaking down the barriers. What does that return and embrace look like? And it's within and without as well. I mean, in your talk too, you shared a little bit about those struggles back and forth,
Mm-hmm.
what that looked like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I really connected well with Shannon Zumwalt's talk there about the creational account from Genesis 2 as well. It gave me a lot to think about because I know one of the things I really struggle with is this idea of, is disability by God's intent, God's design, or is disability from a nature that is not of his intent? I remember years ago hearing that we need to get away from the language of broken, and I resonate with that. I get that, but I also feel that there is a way to see that we are not fully in the cured state, using Amy Kenny's language, in the cured state that God may have intended us to be or is moving us towards. All of us, disability, recognized disability or not. But also, it's hard to discern that in a post-fall, if you want to use that language, world, which is one of the things I was challenged by Shannon's discussion. As you knew, I questioned her on. Really, I thought it was great to see that we can't dismiss the fact that disability can be a God-intended work to bring about a new creative process, a blessed creative process. All right. Well, part 2. Here we go. Starting again.
Definitely. We were kind of talking about what our takeaways were from the conference. I think one of the things that I noted too this year was there's a bit more of an intentional focus on the smaller church communities and what can happen. Like at last year's conference live, the practical presentation came from one of the mega churches in the city that has a whole well-developed special needs ministry. You could probably do hours on whether or not that's the appropriate term for it or not, depending. But so it kind of presented kind of like this is a way, almost came across as the way, whereas this one seemed much more sharing much more diverse stories from different types of communities, especially when we think of like you have not most, but there's the Canadian understanding is usually maybe a house church to around maybe a roughly about 100 people. So it's a different dynamic of what it means to create a universal space for disabilities. And some of those churches coming out of COVID may not even have many kids around anymore because that habituation has been lost.
Hmm. I'm just sort of thinking about that because, coming from a house church background,
Hmm.
we had a number of people with visible disabilities in our house church community. And the way we did church was very dynamically different from the way you see it in a larger church congregation.
Hmm.
Whereas integration in the larger church context was, for the most part, more of a uh, this is going to be bad terminology, but audience participation,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? Whereas in house church, it is very hands-on, intimate,
Hmm.
communal experience. You're in relationship. You're sharing food. You're involved in each other's lives.
Hmm.
You're meeting not just in homes but in community, and it's a much more unique experience. And it also becomes you become you uh, acutely aware of the needs of the other person.
Hmm.
And you also, I think, one of the things, when I think about this, um, setting boundaries, right, is a
Hmm.
key practice. I think when you consider developing community and engaging people with disabilities in a particular house church environment, but uh, the boundaries you set within that kind of context are
Hmm.
uniquely different than the boundaries you would set in a larger church congregation. So, um, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges too, especially as we're getting smaller and smaller in contexts. It's harder to just exist in that inclusion idea that there's space for folks to come in and hang out. It's like you're talking that you do have to a lot sooner if you're noticed, but you also know a lot sooner if anyone's actually going to talk to you at more beyond just the how's the weather, how's your week, and if you say more than fine, it becomes uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very true. Very true. I'm interested in hearing more of how you heard that in the conference because I don't I don't recall hearing, like, I would have loved that conversation and gone deeper into that.
Hmm.
I didn't hear too much of that at the conference.
I guess that, I mean, at the explicit level, probably not, but maybe it's just from the presenters they had coming from smaller church backgrounds. And it's just like they're just comparing last year's to this year's, where last year's it very much was sort of the one church with a well-developed, well-funded ministry program.
Oh, yes,
And this
okay.
year is more of this practical, how do we do this when our churches basically tell us there's no money to do this from some presenters and um,
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that then too. And I agree.
mhm,
I like that better because when you think of like last year's,
mhm,
um, it's very much a serve those who are considered disabled or in the disabled community.
mhm,
Whereas I've always pushed towards it's not serving, it's involving
mhm,
and discipling and incorporating people with disabilities into the activity of community. So I liked that this year too, I think. I think we did more of that. I like to see us grow more into that and maybe expand on it.
mhm,
So yeah. I think when you talked about plenary speakers, I liked Heather Morgan's talk as well, and I was looking forward to her talking about embodiment.
mhm,
Is I think that's something that people with disabilities really need to grow with and be discipled in. When I spoke, I know I talked about the taking of the image of God and going further into the image of Christ, the Imago
mhm,
Christi. And I was kind of pointing to that direction of embodiment, that we can't just talk about the values and the the idealisms of what it means to be engaging those with disabilities
mhm,
and being inclusive and so on. We have to really create a practicality around it. I was really impressed years ago by my friend Preston, who talked about how we go from doing the simple to the complex to simplicity.
Hmm.
And I really feel like we have talked a lot about the complexities of the image of God. Now we need to really, discuss and take further into action what it means to do the simplicity of
Hmm.
engaging the disabled, and really becoming practical, and seeing it embodied, not just personally
Hmm.
as individuals, but also embodied in the community itself of
Hmm.
disabled people participating in church life, in community life.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that's that switch to the understanding of the body of Christ that Paul writes about is literally incorporating all aspects, and that is with even the visible and invisible disabilities. They are an aspect of the body that we can't function without. That's why, even though I'm not a major proponent of Amos Young's theology of disabilities, but I love that quote of his that basically says just what you're saying. Persons with disabilities weren't created for us to learn how to serve. Persons with disabilities are here as co-ministers, as ministers themselves,
Mhm.
just as we are,
Mhm.
called in the body with the own giftings and vocations and purposes. And if we can shift the meta understanding of break through the fog and the bricks and mortar walls have been built up in that understanding, something can actually happen beneficially in renewal, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas, as I spoke of the hollow bricks, so they
Yes.
recognize the significance of individuality and
Mm-hmm.
community, but they interact with one another
Yes.
through that brick and mortar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that actually, Carlos Thompson, when he spoke too, one of the things I really took away from him was his story about, I can't remember if he actually used this terminology, but listening to the body language
Mm-hmm.
of the people in your community.
Yes.
When he told that story of just sit with a person
Mm-hmm.
until you come to an understanding. Person's nonverbal, but there's a communication that takes place
Yep.
when you sit and spend time with someone. And to me, that's a real reflection of embodiment right there. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to learn to do that, and recognize that just spending the time with someone, not scheduling it even, or making it Sunday morning from 9 till 10:30. Spend time with people in your community,
Mm-hmm.
one-on-one, sit down and learn, not just expect the language of your own language, but become multilingual and learn the language of the people who are your neighbors
Mm-hmm.
and around you. I really liked his story there. So yeah. Hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I didn't. And I mean, he inherited the ministry that he has at the university there at the dorm, but where they took it
Mhm.
in that understanding, like you were talking about discipleship, integration, growth, living together, doing life together, being together. And yeah, there's a lot of, I think one of the biggest challenges we have as people is we don't like silence.
Mm.
And so when you're with someone who's nonverbal, it is that nuance, it is that silence. And then there's any physical complexities beyond that. There may not even be a lot of body language to track with. So it really is learning who the person is at that deeper level to be able to. And we had one of the TED Talk speakers using a complete assist device, text to speech, to give their talk and engage with us. Um, Others would use it may be a book, or now they've got them loaded on iPads of pics and pods, so you can carry on conversations and ask questions and respond, which helps as well. But it's being open to these different ways of communication, not just the verbal.
Mhm. Yeah. I remember the lady who used the speech assistive
Mm-hmm.
technology. And I think one of the things, and I've seen this before with other friends who have nonverbal abilities, but she used body language as well,
Mm-hmm.
incorporated into her talk.
Yeah.
So while her speech assistive technology spoke words, she added body language to it to
Yeah.
reflect direction, reflect character and
hmm
personality.
Yeah. Especially because most of the assistive devices don't have that infliction of that emotive piece that we miss so much with communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the other things I was reflecting on and was going to ask you is what are ways that we can take the conversation that happened at the Deep and Wide conference
hmm
and make it go further, make it better? Is there areas that it needs to improve,
hmm
perhaps? Yeah.
I think marketing is definitely one of and this is the challenge. I mean, because we are a satellite location for the conference of Calgary. You can tell that from the different sessions that are happening around Hamilton, the different things that have grown up around that McMaster Divinity School, the press coming out of there, like literally the Mad and Crypt Theology Press, the authors they have on staff that are speaking there on this topic, um, even that one speaker coming directly from a disability serving program, nonprofit. You're seeing that network develop. I think for Calgary and area, one of the things is we really have to start cultivating that network um, of those connections, of those different aspects outside of just academic um, conferencing mindset, but also too, as we both noticed, there was I think one, maybe two actual church pastors in the conference physically there. I don't know who was online, obviously, but physically present at the conference itself. So how do we expand this? I mean, Ambrose has their own traditions that feed into it, like every Christian school has their own traditions. But how do we broaden that tent, get that cross pollination, if you will, from the other sort of denominations and traditions there to have the leaders? Because when you read, oh, I can't, his name fails me now, but he's known as the autistic pastor. When I was reading his book around church and disability, um, where Father Matthew talks about, this is the blessings and this is how you engage an autistic mind. He was talking about how you actually get church leadership to wrap their heads around doing church differently.
Mhm.
And engaging that sort of that, because he comes from an evangelical charismatic perspective. And how do you get the elders to start thinking differently? How do you get churches to start shifting? Part of it's a grassroots up, but it's also getting the right leaders in the room to learn together as well. So how do we get those folks in the room?
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
I don't, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I know you may have seen it after, but I did a quick Google search following the conference, and there's about 355 churches in the
Mm-hmm.
Calgary area. And as you mentioned, there was one, maybe two pastors that were present in
Mm-hmm.
the conference. And I'm not sure that church leadership, whether it's a matter of didn't hear or know about the conference or aren't identifying the significant role they have in engaging people
Mm-hmm.
who are disabled in their community. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I would love to see that grow in future, that we have more leadership presence
Mm-hmm.
in future conferences and conversations around um, involving people with disabilities in church community. So,
Mm-hmm. Definitely, because yeah, I mean that's part of me is just wondering if it's just the reactive nature of the human mind. Unless there's someone who's visible within their context, it doesn't even cross their mind that this intersects with their church community.
mhm. Yeah. To me, it seems a little strange that we have to have that conversation because you read the Gospels and there is
Mm-hmm.
so much Jesus is so involved in people who obviously are visible disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, why does the church not see that gap, that call in
Mm-hmm.
their own role of community? So,
Yeah. And even, I mean, just if we want to think sociologically, I mean, at this point in history in Alberta itself, they're saying 1 in 6 children are born with and or acquire a disability in their lifetime. So can we honestly say any family in a church, if they're honest, that this isn't intersecting with their story and their journey?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Very true. Yeah. So recognizing this need, where do we go from here? What do you think we should do next, as people who are carrying this conversation from the deep and wide?
Hmm. I think part of it is trying to figure out which champions or connections can be cultivated and connected back, obviously, to the lead at Ambrose with some email introductions if they're open to it. Um, Even just trying to get those even listening, our own local churches to engage and see who's around that would be willing to come and talk to us, whether it's to bring them in via Zoom or Teams to something, whether it's, if it's a presbytery or diocese, if you're in one of those traditions or districts or whatever the term is, that collective umbrella with some denominations, right? Maybe it's bringing someone to that level to connect with them. But really, too, it could be as simple as you have a book club coming up on Dr. Amy Kenny's book, My Body's Not Your Prayer Request. And I've mentioned 2 other books I found rather impactful with that one as well in understanding things. So maybe it's as simple as your church, when you're looking for that adult education realm, something to do for spiritual formation, Christian formation, why not pick up one of these books and take a 6-week study of it?
Mhm.
Regardless of your tradition, it doesn't matter who the author is. These are lived experience stories backed up by evidence, which is also a major thing. There are from the Americans first. It'd be wonderful if you could find Canadian ones, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things I would love to see Deep and Wide connect with too, especially the Calgary. They're getting better at it. We saw that with the Friday nights, but really being able to find those speakers who are Canadian or maybe originated in Canada to kind of show us that this is possible up here as well. I think
Yeah.
would be a really powerful thing.
Yeah, and I think if we can manage to draw in, particularly some of the leadership, but people who are
Mm,
in the congregation to really engage those conversations of, you know, who are the disabled people in your neighborhood, and
yeah.
why does Jesus matter to them? Uh,
Hmm.
that's that's a huge thing. Um, we need to try and break down those barriers of, a book about why my body's not a prayer request is not strictly for people who are recognized labeled
Hmm.
as disabled, but for all people, to explore and ask those questions. Um, we we need to do that. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how we do that myself. Just looking for answers,
Yeah.
but we might do that. So yeah.
And every time I find an answer, I get a lot more questions asked. Because even with places you think would be open to, opening this conversation, the amount of hurdles different polities in churches create is astounding.
Yeah.
Like, we'll send the synopsis here to this committee, and then this committee will take it here, and then that will take it to the final approval board. And you're like, you're like, well, I'll jump through the hoops, obviously, but still.
Yeah.
I think too, accessing different Christian publications are out there, whether it's Broadview Magazine, Presbyterian Connection, or Presbyterian. The Evangelical Lutheran Church has a magazine. Faith Today has a blog, so if what you write won't make it into their actual magazine, if you reach out to them, it can make it to their blog. I had a piece on trauma make it to their blog recently. Get the stories out there.
Yeah, I
Start
agree.
sharing the personal stories, but also what your local, I'm going to use the term congregation, but keep in mind when I say congregation, I'm talking about everything from like the small house church all the way up to that mega church.
Mhm.
Whatever that congregation looks like in your parish setting, that community exists in, is doing. Whether it has a $5,000 price tag of putting in a lift or a $20 a $5 price tag. So you bought a couple fidget toys for some of the folks in your living room during movie discussion night to play
Mhm.
around with, right? Let's actually show that there, just like with everything, there's a spectrum. And so having the conversations around our buildings, around our homes, wherever we're gathering, is challenging, is scary. So let's start creating the conversation. Let's start actually uncovering the resources that can help create some accessibility in the physical spaces. So it's not so scary to talk about.
Yeah. 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 And put it out there as, doing things like what we're doing here today,
Yeah.
doing video work and putting it out
Mm-hmm.
on social media so that others can see and hear these discussions very visibly. So that's good. Hmm.
I
It's been,
know. Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh no, I know I'd seen shared. I think you had shared it. First Alliance Church had the series coming up as well that I think would be well to engage with because you engage with it online. So now you don't even really have to leave your own context, but you can still learn. So looking for those opportunities to learn and discover as well as different community groups, different places lean into that universality and are streaming, are providing, like you said, the video content,
Mhm.
being able to access that and share that around.
Yeah, and I know First Alliance right now as well is developing a whole ministry of serving the needs of your community.
Mm-hmm.
They're walking through a series right now on Jesus in the midst of suffering and pain, and how we walk with Jesus through that. But they're also developing a ministry right now of reaching out to the community's needs and
Mm-hmm.
creating almost, I want to say, a volunteer force that will develop
Mm-hmm.
relationships with the neighborhood to address those needs. And I immediately started thinking about how people with disabilities, we face a crisis with caregiving and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, can we approach church communities about caregiving needs? And how do we equip and train volunteers in a church to be able to fulfill some of those loss of caregiving needs that local
Mm-hmm.
neighborhoods are people with disabilities are facing in your neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I think part of that is also creating the honest conversations. Like remember, we had started talking about how if you say beyond just fine or good, people don't want to engage. And that caregiving is a deep conversation because that speaks to the individual, it speaks to the family support structures, and it really does speak to, as you said, church engaging with all those aspects and what's possible. And how do we get the right training and equipping? Where do we find the connections?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And big thing on the big churches here too. First Alliance is a big church, as we mentioned.
mhm.
They can have a large sway, if you will.
Yeah.
But reaching down to the smaller communities as well,
Hmm.
to saying not just come be a part of our caregiving force,
Hmm.
but rather let us train, disciple, equip you in developing your own caregiving
Hmm.
network within
Yeah.
your small communities. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. Well,
Hmm.
Ty, this has been awesome. I'm glad we got to finally meet at the Deep and Wide
Hmm.
conference. I'm glad we got to unpack some of our thoughts from the conference itself. Any last thoughts you want to touch on about the Deep and Wide or anything else?
No, I mean, I want to encourage people to attend it next year, obviously, whether that's
Mhm.
online or in person. Um, and really too, I understand even when you're online, it's easy to go to any of the 3 or 4 sites they had. But really try if you're in Calgary, stay in the Calgary context so you can cultivate those relationships. I'd love to see Deep and Wide figure out some way to allow the folks online and on during coffee breaks to be still online at their local areas to connect with folks. You can still talk to them on the screen. It's a bit challenging. There's a lot of noise, but sometimes we did this with one church and it worked. It worked okay, but at least allowed for that connecting piece. You got to know some folks. I don't know what that would look like or how that would work in those rooms, but it'd be something interesting. And just yeah, encourage churches to experiment, to talk, to get a bit more proactive. Um, I mean, also church populations are aging, so these are normal conversations to be having. How do we make this more accessible? How do we go beyond that building code that probably most were grandfathered about too? How do we make this work? And keeping the idea of dignity at the forefront and engage with folks and ask the right questions. Even if there isn't a quote unquote Christian source for you to talk to, engage with one of the public colleges and universities that have a disabilities program so you can at least start to understand some of those aspects. Because then you can connect, have that dialogue with your theology as well, because that's all this is. It's learning, it's dialogue, it's our lived experience. Be willing to be challenged, be willing to change, be willing to sit, and maybe you will need to find that quiet space for yourself because of the noise coming up, because of the changes happening, and realizing what you have to let go of to make this a reality. That independence, that interdependence, as all aspects of the body of Christ get integrated to change the local communities as a whole. And getting back to the idea of the church, whatever size that takes, is that parish, not as the control valve, but more as that soul, that light, that lamp in the community to provide guidance and connection and belonging, which is the key here we're asking about, the idea of belonging. It's not about just being seen and acknowledged. Those are good things, don't get me wrong. That starts the ball rolling. But are we actually going to live life together and take that risk that maybe one day that will be a person that may not be there? And that one day, that risk, depending on the disability, may be a very young age to a very wise old age. And so that's a real big risk because it challenges all our preconceived notions and having us feel again, which none of us really like those ideas of feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just seeing images of that story from John 9 of the blind man on the side of the road. Why is this man born blind? That he's born this way so the glory of God can be witnessed within him. And if we just take the moment to recognize that, it could be any moment. It doesn't have to be a Sunday morning, any moment.
Yeah.
And you will see the glory of God in your neighborhood, right in your living room. So that's awesome. Thank you, Ty. This has been good.
Thank you. Great to meet you finally and great to continue the conversations. Hoping we can see some growth next year in the conference too.
Me too. I hope we can do this again.
You bet. Definitely.